So thanks again, Matt and Angela and everyone there in Guelph for organizing this series. It's really great. I know I've benefited by watching a couple of presentations so far. Unfortunately, I missed John's, but I can bug John anytime to talk about some of the work that's going on in Pittsburgh. So I think one of the things, I want to highlight a couple things thematically in tonight's presentation. One, sort of the nature and necessity for collaboration in doing what we do and trying to scale this up to the landscape. But also talking about some of the challenges and pitfalls associated with this. So for those of you who joined tonight looking for lots of great solutions, I hope that you take away some problems too. We don't have all the answers here. What we found that I'll get into in more detail is that every building, every city is unique and presents its own challenges. And that can vary quite a bit to not only within, comparing countries, things sound quite different. Talking to folks working in Canadian cities and provinces compared to some of the places in the US, but even within cities here in Ohio, things have been dramatically different and presented their own challenges. So I want to stress up front that what I'm presenting here tonight isn't my work. It is the work of dozens of collaborators and leaders, as well as hundreds of volunteers who have really made this a success over the number of years. So with that, I'll introduce myself. So I'm based at the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. So just across the lake from a lot of you. And I've been here since 2009, where I initially coordinated the state's second breeding bird atlas. And I've been in this position now for about 5 years. And Lights Out is one of the projects that we work on. Prior to that, I worked for West Virginia's Fish and Wildlife Cooperative Unit. So the program that I run is called the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative, and this is a consortium of organizations ranging from nonprofits like the Nature Conservancy, Audubon chapters, up through universities, metro parks, as well as state and federal wildlife agencies, working together for bird conservation. So we function a lot like the migratory bird joint ventures or partners in flight, in that many folks have representatives that come to the table to work on our conservation planning. So we have about 120 member organizations in the network, and really we're trying to address avian conservation at the landscape scale. So the main project that I'll be talking about tonight is our Ohio Lights Out network. So for this evening, I want to talk about how we got there to this statewide network, identifying conservation needs as part of that, and that sort of steps down from these needs, but also informs a lot of what we do. Trying to build capacity through our collaborations, identifying challenges and figuring out ways to adapt and overcome those. And then finally, really taking advantage of the study system. So when I talk about these lights out or collision work, I'm sort of looking at this larger picture and how it informs sort of long-term and large-scale conservation planning, and how we can use these data for other projects as well. So we go through a process much like the migratory bird joint ventures, in that we have some pretty intense conservation planning. So in 2010, we created our first statewide conservation plan, looking at all the birds within the states throughout the various times of year, and coming up with a detailed plan about how we can achieve conservation action for these species. That was intended to be a living document, but it was such a massive undertaking that we're just now actually finishing up the second iteration of that. And that identifies major conservation needs and informs a lot of the work that we do. So since that first plan came out in 2010, we've identified full life cycle ecology as really a gap in a lot of the historic conservation work that has been done. So really looking at conservation issues outside of the breeding period. So things like migration, post-breeding, overwintering. And as a part of that, and in addition to some of the breeding work, thinking about quality forest management across successional stages. So a lot of our early successional species within the states that nest here and that use those scrub shrub habitats at different times of the year, either through migration or during post-breeding periods are declining pretty rapidly. So we identified those sort of two big picture items to move our work forward. So this all comes, to a head with some of the recent work that's been published discussing the avian population decline. So 2.9 billion birds gone from the North American landscape since 1970. And this falls in line with a lot of, what we've seen in Ohio as well. So big loss in migratory birds and eastern forest birds. So that's sort of lining up with a lot of the work that we're doing, both in terms of our collision mitigation as well as forest management. And really in the last few years, this field has exploded and we're learning much more about movement ecology and full life cycle ecology based on things like citizen science data and eBird. If you're a birder, which I'm sure most of you, if not all of you on today's call are, you've probably spent a stupid number of hours staring at these eBird maps like I have. But I find them really fascinating. One, that they highlight that these birds that we've called our birds for the longest time aren't our birds at all. They're really only spending a brief snapshot of time on those breeding grounds and spending a lot of time moving. So if we're thinking about, what are the major conservation issues for species like magnolia warbler, we've historically put all of our attention towards conserving or preserving that high quality boreal forest breeding habitat. When in reality, we've been ignoring what's happening during migration and overwintering. And most of this species overwinters in the Yucatan Peninsula. And this is an area that needs a lot of conservation attention recently. And this migratory path through the Appalachians is one that we see for most of the boreal breeding passerines. And there are significant impacts that I'll talk about and kind of re-summarizing some of the work behind migration and collision work. Birdcast has been another really great tool to help us understand and explore movement ecology. And for those of you that are sort of diving into these collision issues, you're very familiar with Birdcast. So we're talking about a pretty staggering number of organisms moving across the landscape, which is particularly important during the fall. So about 4 billion birds coming across North America to overwintering grounds. We have all these hatchier birds in the population and lots of movement across the landscape. So we really need to start thinking about what those potential bottlenecks are or population concerns as these animals are moving across the landscape. And so at the risk of some redundancy and background information here, I do want to go through a little bit of collision background for those who haven't attended some of the previous talks, and to also bring up some important issues that were discussed briefly, I think, in a couple of the last presenters' presentations, and things that we've really identified and have been focusing on in the last few years. So these birds that are moving across the landscape, most of the passerines are nocturnal migrants, so they're making these long migratory journeys at night, and light is an important cue for navigation. Unfortunately, artificial light is becoming increasingly abundant on the landscape, and that is becoming problematic. Hence the terminology behind lights out and why a lot of programs use that. In some of our discussions, even within the different city programs in Ohio, we've talked about that lights out branding and why are we using lights out when that isn't necessarily the killer. And so I want to get into the weeds with that a little bit today and talk about some of that, because one of the major things is that this is very much a social cultural issue that we're dealing with here, as well as an ecological problem. So the ecological solution is simple, but dealing with those social issues can be a little bit more complicated. But we've been learning a lot about the effects of artificial light on wildlife. And we talk a lot about, in the collision community, the Loss et al. Paper from 2014 and the estimates of annual mortality. One paper that I think doesn't get mentioned quite enough is this McLaren et al. 2018, looking at the effects of artificial light on broad scale habitat use and landscape decisions. So what they found was that birds were sort of moving away from high quality forest area towards lower quality habitats, if you will, places that were more brightly lit. And so artificial light on the landscape is sort of impacting landscape level movement decisions. And that is a huge component of this problem that we want to address. And this field in the last few years has really just blowing up, which is great. It is an important issue, and it is one that is increasingly in need of attention as the human population is continuing to increase, but also develop the landscape at pretty rapid rates. So I want to show you what this looks like by looking at this visible infrared imaging between 2012 and 2020. So a pretty small snapshot temporally, actually, only 8 years in between these two photographs, but there's a pretty marked increase in the amount of light on the landscape. So I've outlined Ohio and highlighted Guelph on the landscape here just for some context. And as I toggle back and forth between these two images, I want you to really look at those areas, particularly around the Great Lakes and some of these riparian areas as well. And so you can see, especially around the Great Lakes, which are an important migratory barrier, globally important stopover locations. This is where we're seeing some of the most rapid developments in artificial light at night on the landscape. Some of this is coming from urban, suburban development, but a lot of it's actually coming from natural resource extraction and agriculture as well, particularly in areas like northwestern Ohio. That's where some of that is coming from. And so, this is a pretty remarkable increase in the amount of light on the landscape just over the course of 8 years. There was a modeling project, a paper published in 2003, showing the change in the amount of artificial light on the landscape from late 1950s projected through the year 2025. So for the three initial maps, those are all historic data, and they projected that forward for 2025. So the map for 2025 is a bit more advanced than we currently are, but we're kind of on target to meet that. So you can see the amount of light in Eastern North America is increasing pretty dramatically. And this is also overlaps with an area where a lot of those boreal migrants are coming from Central and South America through Eastern North America. And for those that are continuing to places in boreal Canada, they're spreading out after they get past some of these areas. And so the light on this landscape really has the potential to disrupt change migratory behavior. And that factors into a lot of our collision work. We're not just dealing with glass. And so the last paper, we know that between 365 million and nearly 1 billion birds collide with buildings each year in the United States. And those numbers are based on the animals that we find. And so some of the work that we're doing now is trying to look forward. What are we missing through our work? And it seems as though that is likely an underestimate and just the bottom of what this potential issue actually is. So if you haven't seen the documentary, The Messenger, I highly recommend it. They do a great job of summarizing some of the global conservation issues for migratory birds. And they spend a good chunk of time looking at bird building collisions, as in interviewing FLAP, and Michael Measure from FLAP is featured on that. So a really great synopsis. If you have not seen that documentary, I recommend it. So a lot of credit is due to FLAP for really pioneering and spearheading this work. They've done so much, but I would say also, at least for the Lights Out programs and throughout the United States, a lot of what we do is sort of modeled off of that Lights Out Chicago program that was established in 1995. That's been a hugely successful program. Instead of looking at migratory radar every night or looking at NexRad and trying to call building managers and businesses to reduce lighting on high movement nights, they basically set that window of when lights should be reduced or eliminated from the landscape. And that's what we do here in Ohio, and it's what a lot of programs do, trying to reduce artificial light at night as much as possible during spring and fall migration. And so this is what the Chicago landscape looks like during that program. So you can see there's still light coming from downtown Chicago. And for these lights out programs, we're not talking about turning the cities black. We're actually just talking about reducing or eliminating excessive and unused lighting. So a lot of the decorative and architectural lighting has been eliminated from the landscape, but a lot of that street level light is still there. And this really comes down to when you think about what are the potential solutions to design issues. We can still have lights on the landscape, but keep it directed or focused at places that it was really intended to be used for, to minimize that light, ambient light getting up into the atmosphere. And we've recently been partnering with the International Dark Sky Association in the last 2 or 3 years to gain some synergy and a lot of work that they're doing. They're doing a lot of really great stuff in terms of trying to preserve dark sky areas. And it makes sense to work with them a lot on this issue. So trying to encourage engineers and city planners to incorporate shielded lighting as opposed to unshielded lighting. So lights out, that's what a lot of these programs are called, and that's where that initial focus is, but we know that it's only part of the equation. The real issue is reflective glass, but it's the combination of these two things and how they interact that I think is really important. So yeah, here's a photo from my friend Heidi, showing a three-footed hummingbird, not in front of a city park, but a reflection of adjacent green space. And it is this interaction of green space and glass that is the sort of ultimate killer here. So here's a couple photos from some of our survey areas in downtown Cleveland, showing reflective buildings, but also we have a lot of these walkways with glass railing that become problematic. In fact, I just got photos today from some of our volunteers. It's not even migration, and they found 8 passerines dead along one of these glass walkways in downtown Cleveland. So some things at play here. We talk about lighting, it really functions at the landscape level. So not necessarily individual buildings, but as you get more concentrated areas of light, that has the potential to affect migration decisions and stopover decisions. So urban areas have the potential to draw in a disproportionately larger number of birds than would otherwise stop there. And these cumulative impacts really scale up quite quickly. Glass, on the other hand, functions at the local or site level. And so it's individual buildings, and it's how those buildings are interacted with the landscape design. Cleveland is quite different, and you'll see that when I talk about some of the numbers later on than some of our other cities, not only because it's on Lake Erie, so it's a really important stopover location for birds, but also the composition of the city is such that it makes for a high potential for bird building collisions. You might be able to see a little bit from this bird's eye view photograph of all of the green space intermixed in downtown Cleveland. So Cleveland has a lot of green space, especially in this sort of public square area adjacent to glass buildings. So it's this combination of brightly lit city on the lake, as well as all this green space and glass makes Cleveland kind of a not great place for migratory birds in terms of potential building collisions. But again, glass it really comes down to design issues. You can still have the buildings that you want, and they can be bird safe. Over the past year, particularly in the last few months, we've been working closely with the City of Cleveland and the Sherwin-Williams Corporation to try to get some concessions to their design. They're building a new global headquarters in downtown Cleveland. And if you Google the design or information on that, it's a very tall glass skyscraper, but also there's a glass campus that they're integrating into the downtown area with a lot of green space around it. So there's a potential that this is going to be a pretty destructive building in downtown Cleveland. So we've been trying to work with them to get bird-friendly glass incorporated into their designs, not really changing the overall aesthetics of that. This isn't just cities, though. When we talk about these lights out programs or safe passage programs, it really, if you go back and read that Lost at All paper from 2014, the largest number of birds are actually killed in residential areas. They're just more obvious and more concentrated in downtown areas. So we have this responsibility to also work with homeowners as well to treat their buildings. So this is a photograph of my house, actually. See a window application on there. And as you can tell from the photograph on the right, it really does not disrupt my enjoyment of the feeding stations. So I'll go through the timeline a little bit and sort of how we got started and then sort of where we ended up with this statewide network. So in 2012, we started a Lights Out Columbus program. It was really modeled off of Lights Out Chicago. So like a lot of our work, we worked with local organizations to make this a collaborative project. So working with the local zoo, the local Audubon chapter, State Wildlife Agency, a couple universities to try to get this off the ground. We were really excited because it seemed that in Columbus, and this is the only thing we had to go off of, but that there was a lot of interest in it. So we had nearly 30 buildings in this concentrated downtown area of Columbus enroll within about the first year or so, including half of the tallest downtown buildings. So that was really encouraging. This was a Lights Out program, so we were initially talking to them about, just reducing or eliminating light on the landscape with the idea that we'll eventually get to conversations about glass. But for us, this is a conversation starter. It is a relationship starter when we talk about lights. I can go to a business or a building administrator and talk about reducing lighting, and it may not have any costs associated with that. And in fact, they may actually have some dollar savings associated with that. When we start talking about glass remediation, that can get quite expensive. And as a conversation starter, it can be scary for a lot of people. So glass is always in the back of our head in a lot of these programs, but we start with lighting. And so it seemed as though there was a lot of interest in Lights Out Columbus, and that got us thinking about expanding this into more of a statewide effort, since our focus is really throughout the entire state and not just Columbus. Before we did that, we set up a small scale collision study in 2012 to try to get a better understanding of this interplay between light and glass. So we surveyed a number of streets in the downtown Columbus area, going past a variety of different buildings, different heights, different facade construction. We documented the amount of glass associated with each of these facades, and we took a standardized set of photographs at night so that we could separately look at the illumination at each of these buildings and how that related to the number of collisions. Unsurprisingly, the amount of light coming off of these buildings did have an effect, but it was glass that was a strong association with that as well. So from there, we started talking to partners in other cities of the state to set up similar programs. So we started with Dayton and Cleveland. Dayton was really excited about it. They even got a collision monitoring program started in that first year, but things were very different in Cleveland. We started talking to the city, government officials, and some of the businesses that had larger land holdings within the city. They were really concerned about that Lights Out branding and said, yeah, this sounds like something we might be interested in, but you can't call it Lights Out. And what's interesting is that, we've heard similar reactions from cities that have similar histories or cultural backgrounds. Cleveland, like a lot of large cities in the region, have a sort of industrial history associated with them. When that industry falls out, whether it's steel or automotive, the city often turns to putting their attention towards the arts community and nightlife. And light, in many instances, can be seen as a sign of prosperity in a thriving city. And so turning off the lights seems very counterintuitive to a lot of folks. So they played with the name a little bit. They even put a diurnal migrant on the logo. I'm not really sure why. Ultimately, that effort failed, though, and we had to sort of walk away from it for a short period of time. Interestingly, around that same time in Dayton, volunteers were going out every morning and conducting collision surveys, and they weren't finding any birds. We went an entire season of collision surveys and found no birds in downtown Dayton. What we found out later is that there is a cleaning crew associated with different parts of the city and different building managers that get out really early and they sweep up all of the birds before our volunteers get there. So there were a lot of things that, so we were underestimating the impacts. It was clear to us because we didn't find any birds, but that's something that we had to address and form a relationship with some of those groups. So what we found in Columbus and thinking about expanding this elsewhere is that we needed to have this sort of basic template for scaling this up and replicating what we were doing in other cities. So we needed somebody to coordinate it. There had to be a local wildlife rehabilitator in that city. We have had other parts of Ohio, Athens, Ohio, and Southeastern Ohio, for instance, really interested in starting a Lights Out program, but there's no wildlife rehabilitator anywhere nearby. We have that same issue in Cincinnati, actually. A museum can be really important for dealing with the dead birds. And so one of these two organizations is likely the salvage permit holder associated with that. A local university can be really important if we're bringing students into that. And we've had a couple grad students here at Ohio State, as well as undergraduate students working on various projects. But it's really important that you engage the local business community as well as the local government. Wow, it's really loud.
Yeah, sorry, Matt. I think you're the only one who has the power to mute participants. So you can actually just take a pause here and do that. Thank you.
Yeah, I apologize. I have been trying to click their microphone, but it wasn't doing anything, unfortunately. But I apologize, Matt. Continue.
Yeah, no problem. And so here in Columbus, this is what that looks like. So there is a museum here at the university, and we work closely with them. I have students here in the School of Environment and Natural Resources that a number of them have done honors thesis projects associated with bird building collisions. And this is also an opportunity to engage college campuses on this. As I'm sure you're well aware, there's a lot of glass buildings on college campuses. So two places where we've seen the most growth in development and urbanization, particularly with glass buildings, are at universities and medical campuses. The Ohio State University is a large university. I think there are 68,000 students here at OSU, and the campus is growing rapidly. And all of the buildings that they're putting up are glass curtain facade buildings. So working with them directly on this issue has been really important. But we also have to engage the business community as well. And we can only get so far, and a lot of the blockage that we've had, or some of the issues that we've had, have dealt with some of the perceptions and what this means for their business in the downtown area as well. So we took this mindset and really started the conversation again in Cleveland, and we rebranded it as Lights Out Cleveland, sort of trying to bring the weight of National Audubon Society's program to it, but also approach this differently. And really the success of Lights Out Cleveland has really informed a lot of what we've learned in the past few years, and allowing us to continue to grow this effort and talk about important issues like glass remediation and bird safe building design. And a lot of it comes down to this gentleman right here. This is Tim Jasinski. He's a wildlife rehabilitator at the Lake Erie Nature and Science Center. So they are a sort of education facility, but they're also a very large wildlife rehabilitation center in the Cleveland area. And Tim has actually pioneered a lot of really amazing techniques for species like American woodcock, which I'll talk about a little bit, but also some of their passerine work as well. And they have really high rehabilitation success rates there. He was determined to get this going, and is really in touch with the local birding community. And we've had hundreds of volunteers since 2017 participate in our Lights Out Cleveland program to go out and survey downtown Cleveland every morning during migration. And it's how he initially set up that project that has brought us a lot of success. So he was really keen on recording time of capture for birds, which didn't make a lot of sense to us at first because we don't know when these birds hit when the volunteers collect them. What we didn't know is that when he was doing this before we set up official surveys, he was walking past the same areas over and over again. So our official survey routes in downtown Cleveland are actually fairly short, and volunteers walk them multiple times each morning. So if they pick up a bird at 8 a.m., that bird wasn't there when they passed it at 7:30 a.m. So we actually have pretty good information on when a particular bird hit. And we've been doing that same thing in downtown Columbus as well. We have multiple shifts where we have volunteers go out pre-dawn. They may walk for an hour or two, and then we have second shift go in, and that's brought us a lot of really important information about when birds are actually hitting and striking these buildings. A lot of it's happening right after sunrise. And so it's in those hours where birds are going out and they're foraging, basically to get those fat loads back up for the next leg of their migratory journey. So yeah, we're walking past these areas. Our volunteers are collecting information on basically the amount of glass at a particular building. We're able to go in later on and look at landscape level factors as well, adjacent green space, things like that. But it's really just having the number of volunteers walking these areas over and over again throughout a given morning, and doing it every morning has been really important. Initially, a lot of the collision surveys were sort of really influenced by what the next red radar looked like, or what we thought it was going to be in terms of like how good of a bird morning was it going to be the next day. What we found is that that doesn't always translate to higher collision rates, though. There's a lot of interaction between the cloud ceiling and weather, depending on that sort of time lag in a few hours before. So sometimes the heavy movement nights aren't always the best, and it sort of depends on what that looks like. So we go out and we survey every day as long as it is safe for our volunteers to go out and do so. Getting all of that information in Cleveland was really crucial to continuing to expand this. So we started Lights Out programs in Akron, Canton, and Cincinnati the next year. And we started a large scale collision monitoring program in downtown Columbus in 2019. And we've got a team of students here in the Ornithology Club at Ohio State that survey campus as well. These cities have proved very different from Cleveland and Columbus. So Akron, it's a fairly dark and a fairly concrete city with not a whole lot of green space in. So we actually found very few birds in the collision surveys there. Cincinnati is different in that there's major rivers that go through the city, and it's sort of spread out into a few concentrated areas. And so trying to figure out how to get all of those areas covered and at different times and dealing with cleaning crews, it's been very challenging. There also isn't a wildlife rehabilitator nearby that handles passerines. So there's a bit of a drive to get any live injured birds into other areas. And so, on one hand, it's great that we don't find too many birds there, but that doesn't motivate volunteers. And so we have real issues with volunteer retention in places that don't have high collision rates. And so we might be underestimating or not sampling areas that need to be sampled because we're not detecting birds in those places. So what we found that, we need to run surveys daily, except in dangerous weather, standardizing routes as much as possible and running them multiple times a day. So if we really just want to be able to do that and we have a limited number of volunteers, we might cover a smaller footprint of the city or the campus or wherever we're surveying. And at least, as we were beginning to scale this up prior to when the pandemic hit, this is what a typical year looked like in Columbus. So through our collision monitoring programs, we salvage between 4,000 and 5,000 birds every year. You can see that the vast majority of those are coming from Cleveland, and that's because of its juxtaposition to the lake, but also the amount of light, artificial light at night in that area, as well as the interplay between green space and glass in that city. And we have big days. It's not uncommon for us to find 200-300 birds in a given morning in downtown Cleveland. And, you know, it's kind of devastating for some of our volunteers, but we're trying to make the most out of that. So these birds go into the museums in each of the cities. So in Cleveland, they go to the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. And we're using them for research that's ongoing. Andy Jones at the museum has been working with researchers throughout the world, sharing those specimen samples. And he right now is collaborating with a researcher looking at parasite loads in a lot of these birds. So they're taking parasites, endoparasites, things out of the eyes and intestines of these birds, as well as ectoparasites. And when I talked to Andy recently, the collaborator that he was working with had sampled some eye endoparasites from hermit thrush, and they found a genus new to North America for these eye worms. And so, you know, we're trying to make the most out of this, making sure that these birds go into the museums and that we're actually, you know, studying them and using that for applied conservation and research in the future. And we have data in Cleveland anyway. Since we started surveying there in 2017, we've collected about 12,000 birds in the downtown area. And that's including a low number of birds, basically not surveying in spring of 2020 because of COVID. And last year, 2020 in general, we had fairly reduced numbers because we were really restricting the way our volunteers, the number of volunteers that went out, as well as how they interacted. So I think it's important to stress that collision monitoring is more than saving injured birds. You know, a lot of our volunteers get involved in this because they want to find live birds, they want to get them to wildlife rehabilitators, and they want to save them. But through this work, we're able to assess building design and landscape factors, assessing post-collision survivorship. And yes, that's John Rice there climbing up a Motus Tower. Looking at the long-term ecological consequences. So as I said, these museum specimens are being used continually. And we've had a couple papers come out that have utilized Lights Out Cleveland data specifically. And really important outreach potential. So one of the ways in which we started to get this program off the ground in Cleveland, where we had a lot of that pushback, was that the community every morning was interacting with our volunteers. They would see our volunteers walking around with their bright yellow vests and butterfly nets. And we started getting a lot of attention. We were featured on nightly news a few times, as well as in print media. And so, you know, we don't necessarily need more data. We know some of the factors associated with bird building collisions, but we can use collision monitoring as an outreach tool or as a way to sort of leverage the actions that we might be interested in getting. So I'll talk a little bit more about this project. I missed John's talk, so I apologize for those who did see John's talk if you went into details a little bit about this. But one of the issues that we're trying to get at is understanding that undocumented impact of bird building collisions. And so all of those estimates of mortality that we have, those are based on the birds that we find. When folks are talking about bird building collisions, you know, there's always this assumption that there is some unknown number of birds that hit buildings, they fly off, and they die later undetected away from sight. There's been a lot of interest in recent years towards professional athletes and head trauma, and how those head traumas manifest later in life into cognitive and psychological issues. And likely the same thing is happening with birds. Most of the mortality that we see in the rehab facility after birds are taken there alive is because of brain swelling, essentially. So the medications that birds are getting initially are medications to keep that swelling down to a minimum. So there's likely some unknown number of birds that they're dying undetected. And we're trying to get at that a little bit with this collision work that Powdermill is leading through the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. So what we're doing is we're putting Motus tags on birds that survive bird building collisions and releasing them back into the wild to see if they're making normal and expected migratory decisions and what their survivorship is sort of long term. So here we have a wood thrush as part of this project that I fit with a nanotag this past spring. and we released. It was detected at a few towers in the Columbus area, but we did not detect it after that. So either it settled and nested somewhere in northeastern Ohio where there aren't towers, or that bird died somewhere away from a tower. So these yellow dots on the right are the locations of all the MODIS towers globally. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the MODIS network, essentially this is VHF transmitter, so traditional radio telemetry, but all the towers are tuned to the same frequency, so that a bird with a tag that flies by this can get picked up. So birds carry unique pulse rates so we're able to identify individuals to that tag. So we've helped powder mill by banding a number of white-throated sparrows and thrushes and American woodcock. And so I want to go through the journey of one of our American woodcock, because we actually get a pretty high number of American woodcock in downtown Cleveland. And I think we're only finding a small portion of those birds because their migration window is a little bit later. So a lot of woodcock coming through Ohio in November after our collision surveys are essentially done. So we had a bird hit this building. We actually had a volunteer watch it hit the building in the morning. She picked it up and took it to Lake Erie Nature and Science Center, where it had a great rehabilitation success. It was fit with a nanotag and then released back into the wild. So it was rescued on April 23rd, 2019, and released on April 27th. And it was detected at these towers in green, moving north across the lake into Ontario and further north, where it likely nested somewhere north of this area in Algonquin Provincial Park. It was picked up that fall in November at 2 towers west of Ottawa. And then it appeared to make a southern migratory journey around the lake. It somehow passed the Pennsylvania fence undetected, but the last we picked it up was November 9th, way down here in North Carolina. So for all intents and purposes, it looked like this bird made a normal migratory movement. So it'll be really interesting to see once Luke and John and folks actually take a look at all of the data collected from this project. They initially reached out to us because they had issues with sample sizes and getting birds in Columbus. And unfortunately, we have no issue with sample size in Cleveland. So we've been able to help them by tagging a number of birds. And again, I have to really give a shout out to Tim, who's developed and pioneered a lot of really great rehabilitation methods. American woodcock have had low success in the past, but he basically, looked to Mother Nature to give them what they need. So he fills, the storage areas for these birds, the rehab areas, with soil, and puts the food in the soil, and actually puts foam padding in the top of those cages as well, because they flush frequently and would die later on from head trauma within rehab facilities. So we've learned a lot about how to rehabilitate collision birds quite a bit from a lot of this work. And so, once we begin to understand the ecological problem, how do you work in a system with unlimited landowners? And that becomes the real question as you think about scaling this up and moving to different areas, particularly in places that maybe aren't as keen to adopting legislation as many places in the US here are. And that's where it gets really tricky. And I don't have all the answers. We know that it's very different from city to city. But the one thing that I will say, and I'll sort of close with here, is that the real key to success for us is partnership. We've only been able to be successful in some of these cities, or begin to have conversations about treating glass, by pulling in a number of partners. Some of that, it initially started with a lot of the traditional partners. So you would expect that groups like state wildlife agencies, Audubon chapters, local zoos and museums would be really interested. But more and more, we're trying to engage industry, private business, in really moving this forward. Cleveland Browns have actually been really interested in this work. The facilities manager there is a birder and has been trying to update the lighting at the First Energy Stadium in the last couple of years to make it compliant with our work. He's actually presented on bird building collisions at stadium conference managers conferences globally. So more and more partnership is the key to our success. And, you know, it sounds like a lot of you are having success in your towns and on your campuses and getting this going, but thinking about, you know, one, how can you utilize the data as much as possible, and who all can be involved in this. And yeah, that's all I have. I know it's not a lot of answers, but hopefully maybe it raises some questions, and I'd be happy to open it up to discussion if we have some time.
That was awesome, Matt. Thank you. Can we give him a round of applause? That was a great talk.
Have we got time for questions?
Yeah, feel free to stay on as long as you'd like. We'll do. We usually aim for about a 10-minute Q&A towards the end. We're closer to the hour mark, but yeah, feel free to chime in if you have any questions. Go ahead.
Sure. I have a question about, you know, these Christmas lights that you get now, they're lasers, and they sort of speckle the front of a house. And my question about laser, that type of lighting, it's kind of disturbing because in where we are, we're very forested, and those lasers go into the forest sometimes as late as 10, 11 at night. And those are during the winter months, but we do have, you know, we have owls and we have other birds around, flying squirrels, that sort of thing. Are those laser lights as damaging to birds? Do birds see those lights? I try to do some research. I saw something that said they use lasers to keep birds off crops in the southern states. You know, what's your view on those?
Yeah, I mean, I think they likely have some impact. It would depend on the local avian community at that time. So I would just recommend avoiding those things as much as possible. You know, one of the issues that we're facing is that technology is changing pretty rapidly, and it's becoming very cheap to have very bright and lights, and a lot of them. LED has made it such that there's very little energy cost associated with lighting, and they last, some cases, like practically forever. So we're seeing more LED on the landscape. In some places, landscape designers or homeowners may have only been able to afford so many lights, or it was complicated to put them out because of the costs and difficulty associated with incandescent lighting. But LED in some instances has sort of removed those barriers. And so we're seeing rapid increase in light. And because it's, you know, on top of that, the color temperature is often higher as well. And so that's problematic because it's brighter lights. And so it's not in that warmer range of temperatures that were, you know, that mimic more natural lighting sources. So that can be problematic too. LED lasers, they can be real problems. And I would say just, yeah, try to avoid them as much as possible. And that's really where design comes into it. So, you know, if they have to use lasers, shoot them at the house and not into the adjacent woodlot. That would be the recommendation.
I have one more question, if you don't mind. So we're largely a residential community. We don't have big buildings. So our problem is residential properties with too much light. But you know, from an educational perspective in the community, is there a time at night where one could say, some bylaws say all lights must be off by 10 p.m., for instance? Is it, you know, you said earlier, first thing in the morning is a dangerous time. You know, if we're trying to get the community behind us, is there sort of a best practice, maybe, you know, 9 in the evening? I mean, it gets dark at 4 in the afternoon here. Is there something that would encourage homeowners, if they can't redesign all their landscape and driveway lighting, is there something we can tell them that would help?
Yeah, I would say, and we get that same question a lot from building managers and businesses as well. They might have advertising, or they might have certain lighting on the side of the building. Key Tower in downtown Cleveland is one, for instance. Their branding is actually, we're all about the lights. So they want to see their building illuminated on the landscape especially for the 11 o'clock news. That's really important to them, as though they can't use stock footage. Anyway, so, we say, oh, it's fine. If the 11 o'clock news is important to you, turn it off at 11:30 or 12. I would say the most crucial period to avoid lighting is those hours prior to sunrise, when birds are really making stopover decisions. So the sunset period, I think, is less crucial because birds are basically taking off. If we're talking about migration, that window and how it affects migratory behavior, the evening periods, hours are not as important. So you don't have to make as much of a fuss about that. If they can turn their lights off by midnight, even, that's something. As long as the lighting is off, really, I think it's most important from that 3 a.m. to sunrise time period is the most crucial. So avoiding lighting during that time.
Thank you.
Okay. So I saw a question about the decals on my windows. That was actually just a roll of ABC bird tape that I cut up into small squares because I had it for free. But one of my favorites is the feather-friendly DIY tape. That's essentially what that was mimicking. Both of those solutions are really inexpensive and I think quite elegant, and they don't interfere much. We work a lot with feather-friendly, and we also have a certified homeowners program as part of our Lights Out efforts, where we provide homeowners with packs of DIY tape to use in that.
Georgia, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I was really interested in your reliance on various partnerships, and I wonder if you've had much to do with humane societies or whether initiatives in other cities have, just because it's a different community who might well care, although their motivations would be different. So they would be upset by the animal suffering more than the conservation implications. But is that a useful type of person to help effect change?
Sure, certainly. I would say anybody that you can engage in this work is great. We have a lot of overlap between our wildlife rehabilitation centers and the humane groups. They're kind of often tend to be associated with them. So volunteers actually volunteer for both of those groups, and we've gotten some of those involved in our Lights Out collision surveys. So yes, they can be really great. So look at what groups are available in your town or city or region, and try to capitalize and include as many people as possible in this work.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the humane groups can be a little interesting, particularly when we're talking about cats as well, because cats are a big problem and part of this, and we sometimes get into interesting discussions about free-range domestic and feral cats. And the importance of songbirds and native wildlife. But for the most part, I would say they're very like-minded, and a lot of the volunteers end up volunteering with the local rehab centers, and we sort of work indirectly with a lot of those folks. But they're certainly a good type of group to engage.
Cool.
Yes, painting on glass can be great. It can be a great project for kids and homeowners. So that tempera paints basically get at a craft store can be really fantastic. And that's another opportunity to work with universities. We've been trying to engage art departments in trying to get glass as a potential medium for art students. So if we can get them to use the paint on glass buildings as a demonstration site. And in some cases, at some universities, they've actually sort of included bird-friendly messaging along with that. And so it's a good potential synergy there as well.
Matt, I was just thinking about one of your first slides about the different light formations, where the ambient light gets distributed. And I'm just wondering, have you seen any transition of light fixtures, whether it's on university campuses or anywhere, that use motion censored lights so that the lights are only on when there's activity, or is it more of an abrupt transition of like, no, let's just install the lights that don't have any possibility of distributing the light upwards? Like, I'm just curious of what the transitions in terms of like type of light fixtures are happening, what people are trying to do step by step.
It's all over the board. It really depends on the region and the landscape and how populated an area is. So Ohio State, for instance, is kind of right in the middle of Columbus. So it's kind of in the middle of the city. And unfortunately, in the last year or two, I think it's kind of going along with COVID, but it's been an uptick in crime around the university, like on the periphery. So they've been sort of more inclined to add more and more lighting on campus and in the parts of the city surrounding the campus that is on all the time. Similar in some of the Cleveland sites, Cleveland State University. So one of the glass buildings that I showed that was actually treated was the law library at Cleveland State University. And they're right in downtown Cleveland as well. So I think it depends kind of on where the site is in terms of the city plan. In Dayton, for instance, the city planning and a lot of the growth on the outskirts of town have been more inclined to use motion sensors and just spreading the lights out and turning, timers that, a proportion of them go off at a certain number of time, and then that sort of decreases overnight. So again, things vary dramatically depending on what that city looks like. I don't think there's any one particular trend. The only real trend I'm seeing is that everything is glass now. And they're incorporating a lot of light into it because things like LED are so cheap to install. So trying to work with the departments to bring about some of these sustainability issues and move the conversation away from only carbon footprints, because in some cases we're fighting an uphill battle. A lot of those LEED buildings are glass curtain facade because they have higher thermal insulation. The same thing with LED lights, lower carbon usage because of that. So long-winded answer to say it's kind of all over the place.
No, it's an informative answer. I just wasn't sure, just what solutions people are using, and whether or not it seemed feasible to reinstall lights, or I was thinking more on the suburban level. It's like more of a residential level than a football stadium level. So
yeah, for residential, certainly engaging the town officials as much as possible, the community officials, and what their city planning is. And we've seen a mixed response where sometimes they're excited about changing lighting. It might save them money in the long term if they're able to switch to something that is LED and shielded and timed and motion sensor and all that. So the community response is quite variable. And again, I think there are some, unfortunately, big cultural differences between, say, Canada, cities in Canada versus the United States. I think you have an easier path in some of your sites.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
Me again. So
Yeah.
there was another lady doing the bird friendly thing from another city or town in Canada. Is she still online? Because I'd love to catch up with her after. I can't remember her name. If she can't hear me, then she's probably left already.
Yeah, my memory is failing me. There were so many introductions. There was someone from Nature Canada who was on the call, but I don't know if they were based in Ontario.
Okay, not to worry. Thank you.
All right, well, if that is all the questions we have, I just want to thank Matt again. That was such a great talk. And if you're still on the call, tune in for our February presentation by Catherine, which I think will be sometime in the first week of February, around the same time. We're going to try to put it on a not Monday or Tuesday. So expect maybe a Wednesday night talk. And yeah, otherwise, thank you all for coming. This is a great turnout and so great to see such representation from different public organizations and bird safe initiatives. And yeah, great to see everyone. Matt, I'll stay on the line for a few.